The honourable member for Nanaimo County.
Mr. Speaker, I was on my feet and the parliamentary secretary got up and I sat down in order to let him go ahead. I had no way of knowing, of course, that he was going to play the shrinking violet and disappear from the debate. Now, Mr. Speaker, when the member for York Simcoe put this amendment on the order paper, I decided not to take any part in this debate, even though I thought the amendment was somewhat puerile and mischievous, insofar as all that it's going to do is to mix up and confuse the whole situation with respect to the Canada Savings Bonds. However, when the member for York Simcoe used his speech yesterday on this amendment to launch a very vitriolic attack, first of all on socialism and the New Democratic Party in particular, on the things which the New Democratic Party members in the House from 72 to 74 supported and to some extent succeeded in having put on the statute books of this country, and also spent a good deal of his time attacking the establishment of Petro Canada, and particularly the acquisition by that Crown Corporation of Phillips Petroleum during the past few days. That speech, Mr. Speaker, was reminiscent of the Coolidge and Hoover era. It could have been delivered by Ronald Reagan or any of the John Birch Society. I recognize, of course, that the official opposition has a hyphenated name, calls itself the Progressive Conservative Party, which I've always thought was a contradiction in terms. But I recognize that a party which is looking two directions at the same time is bound to have a left wing and a right wing. And yesterday, the member for York Simcoe demonstrated the genius which the right wing of the Conservative Party has always displayed of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Whenever they get within sight of taking office, immediately they drop the masquerade of being progressive, and all their reactionary tenets come to the fore. And this is what we witnessed yesterday. The member for York Simcoe talked about the dangers to this country and to the Western world if democratic socialist principles were put into effect, how this country would be pushed back into the stage of human history reminiscent of conditions in Calcutta. Now, the trouble with the right wing of the Tory party, and the member for York Simcoe is, of course, the exponent of it, really never understand the people of Canada. They spend so much of their time talking to the bankers and the financiers of this country that they think those individuals represent the man on the street, and they don't. The man on the street isn't fooled by this bogeyman about socialism. They aren't fooled about the great blessings of free enterprise. They know perfectly well that in the Scandinavian countries, where some of them have had social democratic governments for over 40 years, that they've made progress. only the member for York Simcoe would believe that fable, and if he'll take the trouble to look up the figures published by the United Nations, he'll find it's not true. Of course, as are a lot of the other propaganda figures tossed out by the right wing. Or if he took the trouble to look at West Germany, which has a social democratic chancellor, a social democratic prime minister, and a social democratic government. And he'll find that in West Germany, their economic performance far outstrips Canada or the United States. And my friend can speak when he's if he wants to, when I'm finished. But people aren't fooled anymore. People, for instance, look around in this country and they recognize that a province like Saskatchewan has a better debt situation, a better budgetary situation, and has the province of Ontario. Saskatchewan hasn't got the big deficit that Ontario's got, nor the debt load per capita that Ontario has. So when they try to frighten people about public enterprise and governments using the power which the people have given them to insert some control in the marketplace so that the average individual will have at least a voice in determining their own economic destiny, they recognize the value of such a procedure. Now, the member for York Simcoe yesterday built his whole case about the NDP in the years 72 to 74 when he said that the NDP, along with the government of that time, ceded the expansion in our monetary system and fiscal system that gave us the inflation we are now living with. That's right. Well, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, it was the NDP who moved the amendment to the budget, which defeated the government and brought on the election of 1970. And our opposition was to the fact that the government was giving a $2.5 billion giveaway to the corporations, which, by the way, the Conservatives supported. But the right wing of the Tory party, and the Tory party as a whole, are going to have to come straight with the Canadian people. What are they talking about with respect to the inflationary and fiscal policies 72 to 74? Are they talking about the fact that we put pressure on a Liberal administration, a minority government, to index old age pensions, to index family allowances, to improve the medical and hospital services of this country? Is that what they're objecting to? Yeah. When the member for Winnipeg North Centre asked the member for York Simcoe whether that was what he was objecting to, and would he commit the Conservative Party not to curtailing those services if they took office, what was his answer? His answer was, give us a chance. Just try it. Put us in office and see what we do. Well, that will hardly satisfy the people of Canada. And I tell my friends in the Conservative Party that the people of Canada aren't going to be satisfied with a government that says, you put us in and we'll tell you then what we're going to do. Even better, you put us in and then we'll start to think about what we're going to do. Not going to be fooled by that kind of technique. The other thing that the member for York Simcoe took on hand to criticize was the fact that members of the New Democratic Party supported, in fact urged the government of the day to bring in legislation to set up Petro Canada. They criticized it then. The member for York Simcoe was a member, as I was, of the committee that worked on that piece of legislation. I think we had 19 sessions, at least 12 of them the result of the objections and filibustering of the member for York Simcoe, who fought tenaciously against it, and that's his right, and I don't blame him. Doesn't agree with it, and he has a perfect right to do that. But that obsession has stayed with him, and now he has used the debate of yesterday to criticize the acquisition of Phillips Petroleum by Petro Canada. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's time... Pacific. That's what I said, Pacific Petroleum. No, I'm sorry. It's time that we brought this issue out into the open. And it's time the Progressive Conservative Party told us where we stand and where they stand. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that in Canada for the last 20 or 25 years, 99% of the ownership and control of the production and refining of petroleum products in this country has been in the hands of foreign corporations. I haven't heard any opposition, any protests from the member for York Simcoe. Are we to assume that in the eyes of the Progressive Conservative Party, government intervention in the oil industry is bad, but 99% ownership of the oil industry by foreign corporations is good? Is that where they stand?
That's their position.
I think it's time they told the Canadian people that. And it's significant that when a Liberal government reluctantly and belatedly finally got round to setting up a Crown corporation, and I've been as critical as any of the slow pace at which they have moved, but when they finally did it, opposition came solely from the Conservative Party. And now what's the situation? Well, the situation is this, Mr. Speaker, that in Canada today, we have probably light crude oil sufficient to last us at best till 1990. And after that, we will be dependent for oil upon the tar sands, which can't possibly meet our requirements because of the large capital investments necessary and because of the disposal of the tailings. And the only other way we'll be able to have anything like adequate petroleum supplies will be to develop the large heavy oil deposits which straddle the borders of Alberta and Saskatchewan. There it is estimated there are billions of barrels of heavy oil. But heavy oil, which it is very difficult to extract, which requires new technology, which requires very large investments, anywhere from $700 million to $1 billion for a plant. The difficulty is that that territory is in the hands of private oil companies. They have the leases. They haven't been developing the oil. They've been sitting waiting to some extent until the price gets to the place where it's economically viable to develop that heavy oil. And the Petro Canada has been, and the government have been pushing these companies to get on with the production. Nothing has been happening. And a few months ago, Petro Canada decided to try to purchase Husky Oil Company, which has very large holdings. All the members know what happened. The Alberta Gas Trunk Company, closely associated with the government of Alberta, moved in, bid the price up, and took Husky Oil Company away from Petro Canada. I didn't hear any of the Progressive Conservatives objecting to that. As a matter of fact, the very opposite. They were chuckling with glee that Petro Canada had been denied the opportunity to develop those heavy oil resources. That Petro Canada was not going to be able, on behalf of the Canadian people, to develop the Canadian people's own resources for the benefit of the people of Canada. They were delighted this was going to go into the hands of a private company. And now, Petro Canada has made its second move. And it has managed to purchase from the Phillips Pacific Petroleum in the United States the 48% of the shares which they hold. And they will endeavor, of course, to buy the shares which are held in Canada. But even 48% will certainly give them a controlling interest in Pacific Petroleum. And we have listened all week, in question period after question period, criticism, all kinds of statements made about the impropriety and the foolishness of the government and of Petro Canada in seeking to buy up the shares of Pacific Petroleum. Mr. Speaker, Pacific Petroleum gives to the Canadian people the opportunity they have 10 or 15 years from now of having oil, and therefore enabling us to avoid the tremendous national, the terrible imbalance of our overseas payments, our international payments, from having to import that oil from the Middle East. Every person who's looked at the situation knows that any industry which controls the energy resources of a nation has its fingers on the windpipe of that nation's economy. And unless in this country the people, through their governments, federally and provincially, get some control of the petroleum industry, we are going to go through in the next 25 years what we've gone through in the last 25 years when we've watched the petroleum industry, foreknown and controlled, defying the interests of the Canadian people and blackmailing the Canadian governments. Yesterday, the member for York Simcoe said taking over Pacific Petroleum won't produce 1 barrel of oil or provide 1 job. Mr. Speaker, what it will do, it will enable the Canadian people to get oil when they need it at a fair price to the Canadian consumer. What's been our experience with the 99% American-controlled oil industry? Any member who was here in 1974 can tell you the answer, Mr. Speaker. In 1974, when the price was $4 a barrel and the government was reluctant about raising the price, the oil industry sent their drilling rigs down to the United States. They went on strike. If the oil workers had gone on strike, there would have been legislation on the floor of this chamber within 48 hours.
Hear, hear.
But the oil industry went on strike. The oil industry went on strike and said, we're not going to drill till you raise the price. And they put the gun to the government's head, and the government had very little choice. The government knuckled under, and we've been raising the price $1 every 6 months till it reaches the world price. Are we going to go through that again when we come to the heavy oil? At the present time, we're already net importers of oil. We now import more oil than we export. It's going to cost us $2 or $3 billion in the next 12 months or so to pay for imported oil, even after we extract from the cost of importing oil what we export. And are we going to, once more, when we come to deal with the billions of barrels of heavy oil that straddle the interprovincial border between Saskatchewan and Alberta, are we going to wait and allow the same companies to hold us up to ransom that they held it as they did in 1974? Mr. Speaker, when the Canadian people realize where the Progressive Conservative Party has been standing, at least where the member for York Simcoe has been standing, and when they realize that the leader of the official opposition has committed his party to wiping out Petro Canada if they take office, then I say the Canadian people will realize that the choice in this country is whether or not we are going to develop the petroleum resources of Canada for the benefit of the Canadian people, or whether we are going to continue to be an economic colony in which our vital energy resources are owned and controlled by foreign multinational corporations.
Honourable member for Vaudreuil.